have a lot to cover and a little bit of time to do it in. So we're on Revelation chapter 13. So the lesson that we want to look at is we're not going to be able to go over every verse by verse because we don't have time to do that, and there's a lot of different thoughts in those verses, a lot of information we could dive into. But what we want to do is kind of go over a summary of the interpretation of the chapter. We'll do that first. Then I want to define some key terms that we see in chapter 13. Then we'll read through the whole chapter, because in this one I think it's important for us to read through it, and we'll make some minimal comments on it. And then I want to refer you to some online and some book references for further study. You know, it should be obvious by now that you can't learn everything that you need to know about this in 30 minutes or 40 minutes, so you need to be studying on your own. And there's there are some references you can get online for free, and there's others you should spend the money and go out and buy, because we buy things, all kinds of things that we think we need, and you really do need these references, so they'd be good to go buy. And then finally, we'll end with a discussion of what the interpretation of 666 is, because we will find that in this chapter. So we'll try to get finished by the top of the hour. So in chapter 13, the summary of this chapter is we see basically two agents being described through which Satan works to defeat or destroy God's purposes, and to destroy his people and to destroy his rule. We see two beasts. One beast comes out of the sea, and that symbolically represents earthly governments which have repeatedly exalted themselves against God and his people, and we see that in verses 1 through 10. Then we see a second beast that comes out of the earth, and this represents false religion, and we see that in verses 11 through 18. And so this one is the most deceptive of all of the two beasts, but we also see that it exalts itself above God and causes many unsuspectingly to be lost, because by participating in false religion, they think they're okay, but in reality they're not. So both of these agents continue to be used by Satan today, and will continue to be used until the end of time. And so I modified some of these comments from Brother Kaufman and his commentary, which you can get online. And for this particular chapter, he's got some really good comments, so I would encourage you to read those. In my opinion, there's the visions there, the interpretations of them basically have two meanings. It's a double meaning or a double application. We can see a specific meaning that applies to the time period in which the people that's being addressed into their time frame. But we can see more general principles that are being taught about that can be applied to all times and certainly applicable in our times. And so when we look at the first beast, we can see that beast coming out of the sea, it certainly refers specifically to the Roman Empire. And I've listed a number of brethren who have written comments on this particular chapter, and they agree with that. But that also illustrates the principle of Satan's use of human governments throughout the world and throughout time to wage his war against God and his people. And so this is a tool that he continues to use even today. In the second beast, the beast that's out of the earth, that comes out of the earth, in general, that refers to false religion that's opposed to God, and this false religion persecutes God's faithful Christians. But specifically, we can see that it represents the apostate church, helping to promote the aims of the first beast. And we see that being referred to as the falling away. We see that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where we see the evolution of Roman Catholicism during the time of the Roman Empire. As basically we see the Roman Empire, after Rome fell in 456 AD, or 476 AD rather, it kind of morphed into a political, religious type of empire, where Roman Catholicism basically being the new empire with its new head, instead of being Caesar in Rome, then became the Pope in Rome. And we see that being referred to where it talks about the healing of the deadly wound of the first beast, because he was hit with a mortal wound, but he didn't die. He came back to life, causing all the world to wonder. And I think that's what it's being talked about here. It says this resurrected form, this new form that the Roman empire came back as in a religious, political type of empire. And you can see there's a number of brethren who espouse that point of view as well. The number of the beast, which is the number of a man, which is listed as 666, that refers to the papacy, and Jackson and Brother McCord, they agree with that. They give some very good explanations of that, and I have those referenced later on. Or the number could symbolize the imperfect, because since 6 falls short of 7, and it's emphasized, 6 times 100, 6 times 60, 6 times 1, that which is human is destined to fail. So both definitions are possible, and we'll discuss that at the end. We'll get in a lot more detail about that. So what we see is the beast out of the earth illustrates two principles, that Satan uses false religions to draw people away from God, and Satan uses false religion working in concert with civil governments, which we might refer to as national churches or national religions, to oppose God's work. And if we think about it, we see one blaring example of that in the crucifixion of Christ, that we have the Jewish leaders who were, we could basically refer to them as apostate Jewish leaders, because the brand of Judaism they were teaching was not true Judaism, because Jesus in his teachings was always having to correct. You've heard it been said, but this is the way it is. That's the way he was teaching. So we see those working in concert to bring about the crucifixion of Christ. Now, I know, and Pilate immediately didn't want to do it, but he wound up doing it because both of them had the same objectives. They all had the same objectives, as they wanted to save their power. And that's why the Jewish leaders wanted to murder Jesus in the first place, is because they were losing their power and they wanted to get rid of Jesus because he was causing people to follow them. Pilate gave in and said, yes, I'll go ahead and let him be crucified, because you remember they started crying out, that you're no friend of Caesar's if you don't crucify this man. And he certainly didn't want that to come out. He didn't want to be accused of not being a follower of Caesar. And so we see that principle being established in chapter 13, and we see it time and time and time again. So I think there's some important perspectives here to keep in interpreting chapter 13. And I particularly like these words here, and I know you don't like to be read to, but I just read them quickly because it's faster to do that than try to paraphrase it. But Brother Jackson, in his book on Revelation, he says, does it seem likely that a book dealing with the enemies of God's church would overlook one of the most formidable foes that the body of Christ ever had? Paul certainly spoke of a movement that represented a falling away from the faith. Did John ignore the same movement? Kaufman is right on target when he writes, and then he's quoting out of Brother Kaufman's commentary. There are at least 7 whole chapters of the New Testament devoted to that phenomena called the apostasy. And if Revelation is a kind of book it is devoutly believed to be by this writer, there is no way for that apostasy to have been omitted from its pages. Where are the eyes of those scholars who can write a whole commentary on Revelation and never even mention it? What kind of astigmatism can be blind to the plainest references to it, and what kind of deafness is it that cannot hear the thunder of these middle chapters of Revelation? And I think that's a very important point to make, is that when we think about it, the Roman Catholic Church, the false religion that we see beginning even in the first century, elements of that started to happen because we read about, Paul talking about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 that the mystery of iniquity was at work even now. So it was an evolution over a period of time that this developed. But we know from other studies that, they were involved in a lot of persecution of New Testament Christians. So they considered them to be heretics. And when you look at the time span that's involved, there's a whole lot longer time span in which, false religion persecuted New Testament Christians than the Roman Empire as a political entity ever did. And so when we look at that, it really makes a lot of sense, since the whole focus of the book of Revelation is to encourage Christians to not give up. You're going to face persecution, and you see that over and over again. You're going to face persecution. You're going to face persecution. Don't think you're going to get out of life without persecution. So you got to be faithful in order for you to triumph. Why would God have ignored that and not included that in his warnings? And I think that's a valid point that he makes there. So I put some other references here for if you want to pursue that some about all of the persecution that occurred by false religion, specifically by Roman Catholicism, from its formation through the Middle Ages. I know many of you have a copy of the book Traces of the Kingdom by Keith Sisman. He details a lot of that, and he talks about it primarily from the perspective of being in England and Great Britain. There's another one that's online that you may not be familiar with. This one you can download for free. It was written by a German brother who lived. He lived during World War II. Actually, he was in concentration camps by the Nazis because he was a gospel preacher. He gives a much briefer summary of Christianity and its being persecuted in Central Europe. He talks about a number of the same things that Brother Sisman does, but that's a real good reference to get to. And we need to keep in mind, we haven't talked about it much in this series of lessons, but we've been focusing on, Christians being persecuted. What's going on at the same time? And that's a whole different, another series of lessons in itself, and it takes a lot of time to expand upon. But there was also significant digression from the New Testament pattern occurring at the same time. I wish I had time to read over some of the things, because I started putting together a list of just some of the digressions that had already occurred by 150 AD. But it's 22 till, and we don't have time to do that. So I refer you to these sources to study that. There's a book, you may have it, The Eternal Kingdom, written by Brother Maddox in 1961. He details some of those in summary form. But these are the things that are competing. You got brethren who are falling away. They are adopting practices that God never intended for them to do. At the same time, you got faithful brethren that are trying to endure, trying to stay faithful. And not only are they having to deal with the false doctrine that's being taught in a wide-scale way, they're also being persecuted by a political entity, by the Roman government. So all of this stuff is going on, and God is telling them, be faithful, you're going to overcome, but you have to die in order to get the reward. And so be faithful. So again, don't have time to talk about this much, but just to put things in perspective, if you think, and some people do, they think, the whole book of Revelation is fulfilled within the first century or within a few years of the first century. Well, the Roman Empire didn't end in the first century, and it depends on what date you want to pick as to when the Roman Empire ended. But, you look at Rome wasn't sacked until 476 AD. We see a division of Rome into the east and west that happened in 286 AD. And then Constantinople, which was the last city of the Eastern Empire, it didn't fall until it was overrun by the Muslim Ottoman Empire in 1453. So even if you're just looking for a fulfillment of Revelation talking about the Roman Empire, you're still talking about long periods of time. So I think that's a perspective that we have to have there. Also, if you ask, and it's a legitimate question to ask, if Revelation 13 is talking about, a lot of it's talking about the establishment of false religion, talking about Roman Catholicism and so forth, if it's hinting at those types of things, what relevance would that have to Christians that are being persecuted in the first century? Well, you could ask the same question, what relevance did Daniel have to the Hebrew exiles that were in Babylonian captivity? Because he certainly prophesied about things, some of which was going to happen 400 years or more later. He talked about the establishment of the church. And if you look at the little horn that he talks about in chapter 7, which, I think Brother Jackson and others makes a strong case that might be in reference to the papacy also and Roman Catholicism. He's talking about things that 1,000 years from now. What relevance would that have to them at that time? And I think we have to keep coming back is that the message that we see over and over and over and over again is that, okay, you're facing hard times now, you're being persecuted now, that's life. That's what it means to be a Christian. You're going to be persecuted, you're going to face hard times, they're not going to end until you die and you find your home in heaven, and then persecution ends. And you're not going to get out of it in this life. And I think that's the significance to it there. So another important perspective in interpreting Revelation 13, and both Brother Jackson and Kaufman point out that Daniel 7 is key to understanding chapter 13. And we've already studied Daniel chapter 7 several months ago. But in Brother Jackson's book on Revelation, he shows some very striking similarities between the descriptions that are used in Daniel chapter 7 and in Revelation chapter 13. When we look at the first beast, the beast from the sea, we see that in Revelation chapter 13, we see a composite of the 4 beasts that came out of the sea that we see in the first part of chapter 7, talking about the lion, the bear, the leopard, the 10 horns. We also see that there are some significant similarities between the little horn and the second beast that comes from the earth. And you can see the similarities there. We see a little horn, we see horns like a lamb. We see that the little horn spoke great things. We see the lamb, the beast with horns like a lamb spake like a dragon. We see they both wage war against the saints. We can see that they both prevailed against God's saints, or they overcame them. We see the little horn, he spoke words against the Most High. We see that the beast with horns like a lamb, he speaks blasphemies against God. So we see him doing similar things. And if we throw in there, I didn't have space to put it on the table, but if you look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, we see there in talking about the man of sin, the son of perdition, who was not yet revealed in the first century. We see in verse 4, what does it say that he does? It says, he opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he is as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now, all these 3 references, you can see the similarities in the descriptions between they're being talked about here. So they're clearly talking about the same entity, whatever that entity is, that's doing these things. And then as we go on, we see that the little horn, that it was to persecute the saints for times, and half a time. That's synonymous with the 42 months that we see in Revelation chapter 3, which we know is half of 3.5 years. So it's a time, and half a time. So with that, I want to look at a couple of key terms, and then we'll move on. First, we're going to see this word, or the concept of blasphemy, occurring over and over again in Revelation chapter 13, and I want to make sure that we all have a common understanding of what that means. But when you blaspheme, that means you're speaking evil against, you're slandering, you're saying speech that's injurious to another's good name. And we know that that's one of the things that Satan does. He's a false accuser of God. He's a false accuser of God's people. So that's what blasphemy means. Then we see this other word that occurs, a dragon, and you can see the Greek word that is translated from. And we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but we don't have a lot of time to talk about it. But I found it amazing how just about all of the European translations of the Bible, how they don't translate what the word means. They basically transliterate it into different forms in their own language. And you can see that down about the third or fourth bullet down. You can see the different words that are used in those particular languages, and you can see how similar that is to the Greek word. Well, when you do some research into the word, it basically means a large snake or a snake-like creature. So it's not exclusively referring to a snake, but it's used a lot referring to snakes, but also to long snake-like creatures or like sea creatures, or as you see later on down on the slide there in the Septuagint, you can see that's used in a number of places. In Ezekiel chapter 29, verse 3, it's referring to there, obviously it seems to be like a crocodile, even though in Greek they translate it to use this term. So you can see the similarity on a crocodile and a snake. They're both long creatures. It also refers to large sea creatures. And, you know, the song that we sing quite off and on is Hallelujah, Praise Jehovah. What's one of the verses there? All ye floods, ye dragons, all. We see that's in reference to Psalm 148, verse 7. So there it's talking about a sea creature. But from some of the research I've done, one of the sources I said, and that's listed there, it says in ancient literature that this Greek word was used for snakes regarded as extremely frightening and dangerous. And I think that's the definition that we ought to use. So when we go through this study, when we see the word dragon, think about a frightening and dangerous snake, because as we see on this slide, we can see the uses of the word dragon in the New Testament, that all usages of this word occurs only in Revelation. It doesn't occur anywhere else in the New Testament. And when we look at verse 9 of chapter 12 is when the dragon or the frightening snake was introduced. We see there, he talks about him being a great dragon, being cast out, that old serpent. So he's using a different Greek word, but he's still describing the same creature, that great dragon, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. And so, you know, this ties back into the serpent that was used and that's referred to in Genesis chapter 3. But then when you go and look at what these different words mean and you define them, you can see devil means a false accuser or slanderer, which is the significance of the definition of blasphemy. Basically, he's a blasphemer. We see that Satan, the word Satan means adversary. So if we substitute these definitions in, we can see that what Satan is described as a great and frightening and dangerous snake, that old serpent, the slanderer and adversary of God and his people, who is deceiving the entire world. And that's how we need to look at him. And I think it's useful if we define these terms. And so we wonder, well, why does God use this language here? Why does he describe Satan as this way? Because it's reflective of the methods that he uses. Because throughout the Bible, he's also referred to as a deceiver. And when you deceive somebody, it means you trick them into believing something that they wouldn't otherwise believe. And so the descriptions of him being a snake is consistent with his mode of attack, because we know a snake is not like an animal of prey. He doesn't do a frontal assault, where he just charges up on them and overcomes them with his power. But he's sneaky. He either by stealth sneaks up behind them and attacks them, or he lies in wait until something gets close enough to him where he can strike them. And if he's a poisonous snake, he injects poison to them. If he's not poisonous, he clutches on, holds on to them, doesn't let them go until he's able to suffocate them. And so I think that's the significance there of him being described that way, as being a serpent. And so we need to realize that's who Satan is. And we need to be careful about that. So what we see here in chapter 13 is two beasts presented. Satan uses false religions and human governments which include nationalism, power, wealth, promises of well-being. Those are all things associated with what governments promise to people. To seduce when possible and by force when necessary, to persuade people to live lives in which they do not value or love God above everything else, and that they do not value or love God's values. And so this is how Satan really operates. So that brings us to the chapter that we'll read through fairly quickly. Beginning verse 1, it says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the names of blasphemy." There we see the word blasphemy. And we know from the scriptures that are listed there below that the sea symbolizes human societies or human nations that are in upheavals. And so it's out of the sea of upheavals that this beast forms. So it's talking about the formation of a political government. "And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard." Normally, I don't like to use pictures when the Bible describes things, but these are not animals that we see every day, so I thought it would be useful to put these up here to remind us of what they really look like. "And his feet were as the feet of a bear." Okay, this isn't no teddy bear. You know, he's got big, humongous, ferocious feet. "And his mouth is as the mouth of a lion." So again, as we mentioned previously, I turned it off. John is using the same symbols that were used in Daniel chapter 7 to describe, 3 different world empires here. And so he's combining them all to one for this particular beast. So the implication is that we're talking about a political empire. And as others have pointed out, this beast had the tearing power of the lion, the crushing force of the bear, and the swift, ferocious character of the leopard. And the next verse is, and if you don't want to look at a snake, close your eyes. "And the dragon gave him his power and his seat or his throne and great authority." I think we need to look and see how ugly Satan is. We got good descriptions of him, but this is what he is. And he was given power to this empire, to this government, to do the things that they were doing. "And I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshiped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And there was given unto him a mouth, speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven." So we see he's blaspheming God, he's blaspheming his church, talking about the tabernacle. Them that dwell in heaven is is a way of describing faithful Christians. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 20, we can see that our conversation as Christians, our manner of life as Christians is in heaven. And we see in Ephesians chapter 2 that Christians sit with Christ in heavenly places. So that's another description of Christians there. "And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given unto him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. If any man hath an ear, let him hear. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here's the patience and faith of the saints. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb." And so as we mentioned previously, a lamb suggests sacrifice, hence it suggests religion. And when you look at a lamb, you don't get the picture of something like a lion or a leopard or a bear. You don't get something as being ferocious. So that's part of the deception of this, is that this beast is just as deadly as the first one, but it doesn't appear so. Okay, again, if you don't want to see a snake, close your eyes. "And he spake as a dragon." And this is the false religion that we've talked about. And he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. And notice, and he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword and did live. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, and the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. So here we see this second beast. He does great wonders. It looks like he does miracles, but obviously these are fake miracles. These are not real miracles, because only God can perform real miracles. Notice how similar some of the language here is over in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 2 through 10. We're running out of time. We got 5 minutes. I may hold you over for 5 minutes to finish this. But focus on what I have bolded there. Notice, one, we see that it talks, there must be a falling away first, that the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. Notice the blasphemous attitude that he has. He opposes, he exalts himself above all that is called God or that's worship, so that he as God saith in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Notice going on down, verse 9, it says that he has power, signs, and lying wonders, with all deceivableness of unrighteousness. These are the things that he uses to deceive people into following him. So we got similar language here used. We got in Revelation chapter 13 doing great wonders, doing miracles. They're fake miracles, fake wonders. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, we got him talking about lying wonders and doing all kinds of things to deceive people. And this is, again, referring to the same false religious entity that's being talked about. And he causeth all, both great and small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Now again, we don't have time to go into all of this, but I strongly encourage you. I mean, there's the reference to Brother Kaufman's commentary on Revelation chapter 13. I'm not saying everything in there I agree with, everything you might not agree with, but he's got a lot of good thoughts in there, and it gives a good explanation for these two beasts. Also, Brother Jackson's website, Christian Courier, he has some articles online there talking about the man of sin and the little horn of Daniel. It talks a lot about this, and I'd strongly encourage you to look at that. And if you can get a hold to the Denton lectures on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and Philemon, there's some good articles, there's some good lectures there on this particular subject. It's got a lot of good information that helps explain this. And then if you got the Gospel Advocate commentary on Revelation, that's a good chapter on chapter 13. And again, on that particular commentary, I don't say I agree with everything there. And what I'm finding more and more is you can have commentaries written by 6 brethren, and 6 brethren don't all agree with each other because it's so complex. It's not because anybody's trying to teach anything wrong. It's just that there's so much, well, y'all know from reading it, it's just, there's so many different ways you could go with it. And you really have to stop and think about it, and it takes a lot of time, and it really wears me out, and it wears Matt out, I'm sure, with these lessons. And so we're at the last few slides on what 666 is. So if you don't mind, stay with me till I finish that. We don't have too many more. So here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So Brother Jackson notes, and we can see from the reading of it, is that the number denotes the name of a beast. It signifies the name of a man. In order to decode the mystery of the man's name, it will require wisdom and understanding. It will require a lot of wisdom, a lot of understanding to be able to decode it. But what's significant, and he makes a big point of this, and it's very significant, is the Greek word that's used there. It's translated as counted. It's translated correctly. It really means to count or to calculate something. So basically, as he says there, quoting amounts, he says, verse 18 is an invitation to work backwards from the number 666 to a name for which it is a numerical equivalent. And so what do they mean by that? And the only other reference, use of this word in the New Testament is in Luke chapter 14, verse 28, where he says, for which of you intending to build a tower sitteth not down first and counteth the cost, whether he has sufficient to finish it or not? That makes it very clear what the word count means. And so what are they talking about? Well, unlike how we do numbers today, because our numbers are based on Arabic numerals, a lot of the ancient civilizations, they had to use letters to represent numbers. And so a letter could be a number or it could be a letter, and they had a certain mark that they put by it to designate it as being used as a number as opposed to a letter. Well, you can imagine you can come up with all kinds of puzzles when you write out a word, write out a name, write out a word with letters, and then you interpret those letters as numbers. They then become numbers that you can add up to come up to a total number. And that's apparently that's what's being referred to here, and it was apparently something that was a fairly common practice back in those days, at least among the Jews and some among the Greeks. And you see an example of it there, that the Greek word for Jesus that's listed there, you can see the different Greek letters that make that up. The table off to the right shows that each Greek letter and what its numerical value was. And so when you spell out Jesus and you add up the numerical value of each one of those letters, it equals 888. Well, the symbol that's down below that, the large symbol, is what 666 looks like written in Greek letters. And so that's what we got to determine, well, what does that mean? Well, there's three commonly accepted interpretations of it. Get my paper flipped over. Some believe it's Nero Caesar, but they got to do some convoluted things to do that. They have to convert the name into Hebrew letters, and then they have to, calculate what those Hebrew letters equal. And as we've already shown in this series of lessons, and also it's documented in a number of good commentaries, that there's strong evidence that Revelation was written well after the destruction of Jerusalem, and so it couldn't mean Nero Caesar. And John's writing to Greek-speaking Christians, so why in the world would he expect them to be able to speak Hebrew and be able to translate those letters back? So it's a convoluted way, and that doesn't have much credibility, doesn't have any credibility in my opinion. The second one is that it refers to the papacy. And again, we don't have time to talk about this. I got all the references listed there. These are online references, and then you can buy these books yourself where they go in quite a detailed discussion about why 666 refers to that. And the punchline is that when there is a word, Latinos, and when you add up the letters to that particular word, it adds up to 666, and that particular word means a Latin man. And what gives it a lot of credibility in the brethren that reference this, and the fact that it tells you got to count to come up with this word, so you got to count something. I mean, Irenaeus in the late first century, early second century, he wrote a book. He wrote a number of things called Against Heresies, and in there I got some quotes from what he wrote, and he referenced this as one of the possibilities of what 666 means, and he says that's very probable what it is, but then he urged caution, that, well, we really can't say for sure, but this appears to be the strongest possibility. One of his disciples that's listed there, he referenced that later on in a treatise that he wrote. So when you look at that word and you say, okay, well, he wasn't inspired. He was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp was said to have been converted by the Apostle John. That's pushing it pretty close to the time of John. So it's saying at least at that particular time, people were looking at that. And when you think about it, I mean, you look at the argument that he makes. He says, well, it's the Latins who are at present that bear a rule over us. Well, what may seem hard for us to see, if we were under rule by the Romans, if we were under rule by the Latins, it might not be so hard for us to come to that conclusion. And so that, in my mind, makes this a very good case for why that's a possibility. Another possibility, and then that's the last one, is, and Brother Haley talks about this some in his commentary, is because you got the number 6 emphasized, 6 times 1, 6 times 10, 6 times 100. That's what it means when we write 666. It's not that we're writing a numeral 3 times, because they didn't do it that way back then. But even using the Greek letters, it still meant the same thing. 6 ones, 6 tens, 6 100s. It's emphasizing the concept of 6, and 6 is far below 7. It's imperfection. It's never going to be perfect. So it's talking about human endeavors that are going to be destined to fail. And certainly, if you look at it as being the papacy, if you look at it as being false religion, it's saying the same thing, because this is a human invention. It's not a religion that was that God created, and so it's destined to fail. Salvation is not to be found in that. So we got to stop. I appreciate everybody listening, and I'm sorry I didn't have time to make comments. But Keith, could you lead us in a quick prayer real quick, if you don't mind?
Father, we're so grateful